Welcome to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. Let's start with a text from Andy, who says, Mike, I just watched Kevin O'Sullivan's interview with Robert Gendrick and couldn't believe how he totally dodged the question about local communities being imposed with hotels filled with illegal immigrants without any consultation or representation. Just keeps trotting out the same fictional ideal ideas which he cannot possibly achieve whilst we have a useless government who allow the European Court of Human Rights to determine the UK's values. Well, I can see your point there. We'll bring you some clips and some little hits from Robert Gendrick's conversation. But as you would expect, you know, he did answer some questions. We didn't really give anything away that we didn't already know. Let's talk to Madeline Grant, columnist at the Telegraph, and let's get her take on the day. Madeline, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. There's always, as ever, so much to talk about, but I guess we sort of should kick off with the Bibi Stockholm, and it's created this kind of, for me, sideshow about the whole immigration debate. It's a sideshow about how many people can you get on a barge, how many people have you got left who are not on the barge, an awful lot of them, and just this kind of ridiculous toing and froing between the people in Britain who seem to think that all immigration is fantastic and others who are a bit more concerned about the sort of localised effect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the debate is something of a red herring because, you know, we talk so much about this one barge, but that amounts to, you know, maybe a couple of days of channel migration equivalent. You know, meanwhile, the hotels continue to be a massive problem. And obviously, the push and pull factors haven't really been addressed so far, despite the government's best efforts. So I think it's kind of, I don't know, it's one of those areas where we're really getting ourselves into a lather about something that probably won't make much difference to the overall problem. No. I mean, I suppose the government is constantly in search of something, some silver bullet that will make the people who are coming across the channel stop coming. But I don't think the barge is it, is it? No, it's not. I mean, there'd have to be, I'm sure, a range of different issues, but fundamentally it goes back to the, you know, the law and the human rights law that essentially facilitates once people arrive here that their cases will be tangled up in the legal system. And then, of course, you've got the problem of the massive backlogs and the sort of slovenliness of government departments in dealing with them. So it's like the worst of all possible worlds. Yeah, I mean, I was reading your piece in the Telegraph today, which we'll get to in a minute, about the state of London, but you talked about coming to the city 9 years ago, and 9 years ago, the civil service was a much smaller organisation than it is now. We hear this morning that the loophole that they've now sort of managed to operate has created this surge in civil servants on much more money than they used to be. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you worked in the civil service, you got paid less money because you could retire earlier, you got better perks, you got a better pension, and so it sort of all evened itself out. But now there are people getting paid vast amounts of money, including packages and all sorts of great pensions as well. So it's a sort of double win if you're a civil servant now. Yeah, that's really important, because often in the debates about civil service pay and indeed public sector pay, the whole point about the pensions is just completely ignored, even though that's a big part of the remuneration. Yeah. So you really ought to talk about the pensions in the same breath. But, you know, it seems like what's happened is that the civil service has been told by ministers, been told by Oliver Dowden that they need to cut their costs, that they need to show pay restraint because that's what workers in the private sector are experiencing. And their way of getting around this has been to kind of promote people to higher levels so they can still get paid more. And this, I think, is a bit of a kick in the teeth to many workers in the private sector who haven't experienced anything like those kind of rises, and of course they're the people that ultimately fit the bill. But the thing is, I mean, on its own, I'm not actually that fussed about some civil servants being paid really well. I think you do want to attract good people from the private sector, and there are many civil servants that do a great job. But I think that's incompatible with the fact that the civil service seems to expand all the time. I think you've either got to have fewer people and pay them better, or, you know, have a larger workforce that isn't paid kind of sums. But what you can't do is have both at once. I think that's what really, there's a real problem in the civil service of accountability, where, you know, it's quite hard for people to get sacked or punished for bad performance as in the private sector. So I think you need to, if you are going to do the pay rises, you have to show that you're getting good value for money elsewhere. Yeah, there doesn't seem any accountability or any scrutiny either. You know, people seem to get away with whatever they want. If a minister appears to be a bit too rambunctious and comes into a new department, tries to sort of sweep it clean, they get accused of bullying. You know, we've seen that happening with all sorts of Tory ministers, and we've seen people getting paid off vast amounts of money. But of course, the other thing that they do is it's the only business, I think, in the world where you can go up to someone
someone and say, could you run this project for me? How long do you think it will take? Or could you get me a report? And they go, about 2 years. You know, in any other sort of private business, you'd be going, well, maybe a month. Could we do it in 2 weeks, maybe? You know, they get 2 years to do stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I think it goes back to that problem of accountability. There's not much transparency, and if people don't perform well in one department, often they just get shuffled off to another one. They get kind of swallowed in the larger structure of the civil service. You know, I think you have to look at what was the civil go back to first principles and maybe take a look at what the civil service was like when it was universally agreed to be performing well. And I think you would find that it was set up in a very different way than it is today. Yeah,
I mean, do you think that we are at a point where the government can no longer claw back what authority it used to have? Because it seems to me that we've got a government now, and it might be because it's been in too long, it might be because it's a bit jaded, but it can't seem to get anything done. You know, Rishi Sunak will announce something in the House of Commons and then nothing kind of happens, and then nobody really bothers that nothing happens, and we just kind of saunter on and go, oh, well, you know, he said he would do something, but he really can't because of those civil servants.
Yeah, it's a really odd feeling, isn't it, to think that it does feel like this, that we have a government that actually has very few levers that it can pull, very little that it can actually feasibly do at its disposal, whether it's financially in a very straitened position. It's very much hampered about how much it can borrow and spend. And there seems to be a cross-party agreement on that. You know, Labour is not rocking the boat with big spending pledges either. It seems like no matter who's in charge, you get probably different versions of the same thing. And actually, it will be, you know, let's see what happens if and when we have a new government in. I strongly suspect that they will face many of the same obstacles that the Conservative government faces. And I suppose some of it goes down to, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how, as you mentioned before, the ministers come in, are in charge of a department, and then there is massive amounts of hostile leaking that seems to be coming from the civil service. This makes the functioning of policy very, very difficult if it's operating in that environment where great acrimony and resistance to whatever it is the government's trying to do.
Yeah, I remember Stephen Barclay when he was, well, still is Secretary of State for Health, and there was about to be a nurses' strike, and suddenly all this leaking started happening to The Guardian, where effectively the story that they wrote was, he's not really a very nice man. I mean, that was about as bad as it got. You know, they were like, well, sometimes he's a bit short with people, and, you know, occasionally he writes curt notes, and, you know, the worst they could come up with after the Dominic Raab fiasco was that they didn't think he was a very nice bloke.
Yeah, and, you know, Suella Braverman, there's, you know, many reasons to criticise her performance so far, but I thought it was kind of pretty insane how the story about her speeding ticket, how that became magnified, and it did seem to be coming from Mandarins, because she had consulted with the civil service about whether, with her own officials, about whether she could do the course remotely or whether she had to be there in person. And that seems like, I mean, that's quite a small thing, but it was magnified enormously, and in the media too, people were acting like it was, you know, the end of her career. There's sometimes a big overreaction to small things, and it's not helpful. The media cycle. Oh, yeah. Well, that happened to Lee Anderson, didn't it? Just because he said something to the Daily Express in an interview, which an awful lot of people actually agreed with. You know, there were all sorts of people calling for him to be fired, to be offering up his resignation because he used the F word. I mean, as if politicians don't say it every day. But stay with us, Madeline, if you would. I want to talk about Sadiq Khan. We'll talk about London.